Welcome, everybody, to the virtual launch of my book, Virginia Faulkner, A Life in Two Acts, just published by Bison Books and the University of Nebraska Press. Joining with me today are two writers who provided really invaluable support and advice throughout this project. First, Debbie Applegate, who we're very impressed to have because Debby won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for biography for her very first book, so that's really knocking it out of the park. Um, for her first book, The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher, and in 2021, she published Madam, the biography of Podley Adler, icon of the Jazz Age, which has a connection with Virginia Faulkner that we'll talk about a little bit later. So welcome, Debbie. Uh, Also with us today, we have Will Fellows, who's the author of Farm Boys, The Lives of Gay Men from in the Rural Midwest and other books. Uh, Will is now working on an auto/biography in progress, In Search of Willa Cather and Myself, which is a book that deals in part with Mildred Bennett, who is the founder of the Willa Cather Center in Red Cloud, and another woman who had a special connection with Virginia Faulkner, as well as Bernice Sloat, who was Virginia's partner in Lincoln in the latter days. So thank you for joining us, Will. And I have to thank both Debbie and Will. Throughout this project, they've provided contacts. They've both of them have read the book in manuscript and provided useful advice and just pure moral support because writing is a very lonely profession. Involves many hours by yourself. So it's nice to know that there are other people out there who sympathize with you. Uh, so I thought it might be worth taking a few minutes to talk about how I came to write about this woman that almost nobody knows now and has been long forgotten, and who I have to say up front has no relationship with William Faulkner. So he was from the Mississippi Faulkners, she was from the Nebraska Faulkners. They probably meet somewhere way down the family tree, but they were not related. And so I have a little presentation that I'd like to share with everybody. So, a question that many authors are confronted with after they publish a book is, why did you write this book? And so I thought I would give a little background rather than do a reading from the book, because I hope you all read it, you all buy it and read it and find that it's the most fantastic thing since sliced bread. Um, so, my hobby for a long time has been searching for and writing about books that have become unjustly neglected and fallen out of print. And one of them that I read, and I think it was back in probably like 2009, was this book, My Heyday or The Crack Up the International Set, which was supposedly the memoirs of this woman named Princess Tulip Murphy, as told to Virginia Faulkner. Now, Princess Tulip Murphy was this sort of, I call her a gate crasher extraordinaire. So she was this woman who essentially abandoned her family and went off in search of hanging out with the rich and famous and silly. The funny thing about these stories is that they were published in Town and Country magazine. And if you know anything about Town and Country magazine, you know that it is about rich and famous people, and not always famous people, but rich people, and the ways in which they spend their free time and their money. So a lot of what she was doing was really mocking the readers of the magazine that was paying her for these articles. So as I usually do when I read one of these books, I kind of go look at, who was the author and who is the author and um, what's her background? How did this book come to be? So I looked, and there wasn't a lot of information on Virginia Faulkner. Um, and what I did find was this listing in a reference about little biographical sketches of contemporary writers. And looking at this listing, it struck me as sort of an odd career trajectory. So we have her at the Washington Post in 33, 34. She's working for Town and Country right after that. She worked at Metro Goldwyn Mayer as a screenwriter. And then she spent this stretch of almost 25 years at the University of Nebraska Press. And that seemed like a strange left turn to take in a career for a writer. Um, and it kind of stuck in my head, and that was sort of the end of it for a while. And then in early 2020, I was working on a master's degree in biography, and I was looking for candidates to write about. And my mind came back to Virginia Faulkner and that strange turn, and I thought there must be an interesting story behind that. Because she was quite successful when she was a writer in New York City, mostly. Well, early on in my career, I was looking for information about Virginia, and I found this photo in the Kansas City Library, which was part of the Dana Suisse paper. So in this photo, we have from right to left, we have Virginia. Polly Adler is the woman standing up, the Jazz madam that Debby wrote the biography of, and Dana Suisse, who's in the Moo, and then a man we've never been able to identify standing behind them. And I thought, well, if I do something in a thesis, I'm going to need some photos. So let me find out how I can get the permission to this. And that led me to Peter Minton, who is the executor of Dana Suisse's estate. Peter is a wonderful pianist. He actually, my wife and I went to see him when we lived in the San Francisco area, and now lives in New York. And Peter was super generous in responding to my request, not just about the photo, but when I told him what I was planning to do, a project on Virginia Faulkner, he gave me tons of references and contacts, including Debby and also Samantha Shada, who's with us here today. And when I contacted Samantha, she had done some research on Virginia, and she shared a bunch of letters, PDFs of a bunch of letters that Virginia wrote to her brother Eddie in the early 1930s. And one of them was this letter that Virginia wrote just before deciding to quit her job with the Washington Post and to move to New York City and take her chances as a writer based on the sale of her first novel, Friends in Roman. Now, you have to picture this. This is Virginia. She's 21. She's left Radcliffe without graduating because she was offered a job as a feature writer in the Washington Post. The Post owner, Eugene Meyer, who, by the way, was Katharine Graham's dad, he loves her work. But most of what she's been doing is this sort of silly stuff, these little silly filler pieces, mostly that have appeared in like the Sunday supplement. And it was sort of the material that she ended up writing a lot of, which was, rich people being silly. And so she has this job with the Post. The Post loves her, but she's decided I've sold my first novel to Simon and Schuster. She's got to rewrite it, and she's just decided to quit her job at the Post and move to New York City. And she's trying to assure Eddie, who's a very conservative guy, that everything will be okay. And towards the end of this letter, she writes something that I think was really amazing for a young writer of 21 to say. And she says, I've come to the end of one line of development and cashed in on it partly, which was this sort of wisecracking, funny, lighthearted stuff. She says, but if I'm ever really going to be any good, I'll have to give up this smart, know-it-all line for something a little kinder and truer. And I thought that was really, for a writer to be that insightful early on in the process was remarkable. But if we look at what then happened, we find that she didn't go that way. And so that what led me to kind of postulate that her life kind of happened in two acts, with act one being chasing after the mantle of another or the next Dorothy Parker, which is how a lot of things referred to her in those days. So she had this novel, Friends and Romans, that was something of a bestseller at its time. It was very lighthearted. It came out in May of 34. It was sort of like a screwball comedy in print, if you will. And she followed right away with The Barbarians, which is sort of a sequel to Friends and Romans. It's even less substantial than Friends and Romans. Funny little book, but very forgettable. She goes to Hollywood based on the success of those two books. She works for a number of years. The only screen credit she gets in that whole time is this one completely forgettable movie called Bridal Suite, which didn't even come out until like over a year after she left Hollywood, starring Robert Young and the now forgotten French actress Annabella. So we know that Young was actually something of a hot star in his many years before he was Marcus Welby, MD. And she wrote these Princess Tulip stories. And when the first collection of Tulip stories came out, My Heyday, you can see that she was referred to by Clifton Fadiman, who was an editor at Knopf at those days, as well as the book editor for New Yorker, as Dorothy Parker gone informal to the point of madness. And I love this line, which could not have gone well over well in Lincoln, Nebraska in those days. Curl up with My Heyday and a pack of marijuanas, crown size, and have yourself a good debauch. And she began writing these magazine stories that appeared in Saturday Evening Post and Liberty and American Magazine and some of the most popular, successful nationwide magazines. And this was the days when these magazines would have subscriptions in the tens of millions. So she was getting, and she would get her name as a credit on the cover. So she was considered a big deal. And she got involved with Dana Suisse, and the two of them decided to take a stab at writing something for Broadway. They wrote this play called It Takes Two, which opened and closed in the space of a week. It got scathing reviews, and partly because it was considered so lightweight that it was essentially, as many people commented about Virginia, that her wisecracks could become unendurable because they just came constantly. And she did have, I think it was sort of a symptom of her manic personality. Uh, and so the good news about It Takes Two is they sold the film rights to RKO, even though it was never filmed. They made a fortune by 1947 standards, which they split 50-50. Dana took her money and went to Paris to study composition with the very famous composition teacher Nadia Boulanger. And Virginia kind of fell apart. And she ended up admitting herself into a private and very discreet sanitarium called the Haven in Rochester, New York, where she very likely was subjected to multiple rounds of electroshock therapy. And she comes out to New York, and sort of to help her get her sea legs back again. Dana Suisse greets her at the train and says, "I have an idea for a project," and that project is this cooperation with Polly Adler. And so this is actually them having lunch at a notorious drag club called Club 181 in New York, a day or two after Virginia got back to New York City. And Virginia cooperated on this book, A House is Not a Home. And one of the great things that Debby shared with me was for a long time, people denied that Virginia had anything to do with A House is Not a Home because there's no credits in the book. She never took any money for the work. And so there's actually an edition of this book that came out in the early 2000s from the University of Connecticut Press that suggests that Virginia actually had nothing to do with it. And Debby located a collection, the last remaining set of notes that Virginia had from working on the Polly Adler book that makes it quite clear that she absolutely had to deal with it. There also are the Anne Watkins was Polly Adler's literary agent, and in the Anne Watkins papers at Columbia, there's a ton of evidence that makes it clear that Virginia, in fact, did a lot of work, and it was a project of almost 2 years from start to finish. So it was a significant amount of work that she put into it. And that kind of, I would argue, gave her the taste of what editing books was like and led to Act Two, where she returns to Lincoln. She's actually sort of accidentally at a cocktail party offered a job of putting together this book that came out in the late 50s called Roundup, a Nebraska Reader, an anthology of Nebraska articles and books of, and articles and essays about Nebraska, including some by Willa Cather. And this was really Virginia's project from start to finish. And from that, she went on when Bruce Nichol arrived in the late 50s. She worked with him. They put together this phenomenal series, which is still out, the Bison Books series. And they began the very long project of the Willa Cather activities and starting to collect the uncollected works of Willa Cather, starting with this book, The Kingdom of Art, that was worked on and edited by Bernice Sloat, who became Virginia's partner. Uh, Virginia could be relentless as an editor, and in some ways, I'm kind of glad I didn't have an editor like Virginia because she did burn a few authors out. And one of the things I write about in the book is her relationship with a guy named Bill Curtin, where over the course of 8 years for the one of the Cather collections, she just constantly bombarded him with these letters that could be as long as 15, 16 pages long with details of things he had to do with. And as I write in the book, it sort of shattered Bill Curtin, which is not the sort of relationship an editor should have with an author. And she was kind of a workaholic, which was in keeping with her manic tendencies. So in a letter here from 78, she writes the novelist Wright Morris that my life is work, 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 frozen dinner and the feathers. And if it wasn't, I would say for Bernice Sloat, who would often swoop in and help her out in when she hit the bottom and try to get her back to a productive state. And so Virginia and Bernice embraced this Cather project that they undertook in the last really the 60s and 70s. Um, that culminated in the Willa Cather centenary in October of 73, where we had the first international Cather conference. And they really considered that sort of a signature point because part of their goal was to get Willa Cather recognized as a great writer, period, not a Nebraska writer or a Midwest writer, which were sort of considered slights in the literary world at that time. And I think it's striking that when she did die in September of 1980, she was remembered first and foremost as an editor and not as a writer. And it kind of is a reflection. That's one of the reasons why almost nobody knows her name today is that editors, of course, unless you're Max Perkins, you're generally going to be forgotten because, as Virginia would often stress, the author gets the name on the book, and the editor just goes home tired and full of headaches. And this sort of was my inspiration for the structure of the book was really this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is in the Last Tycoon, which is there are no second acts in American lives. And I think Virginia has by even though she was almost at rock bottom when she came back to Lincoln, Nebraska, she found something that gave her a lot of her life a lot of meaning and embraced that and took it forward. And so that kind of is the genesis of this book that we're going to talk about today. So with that, um, I have a few questions that we'll start with Debbie and Will, and then open it up for broader discussion. Um, so one of the things that I would argue helped Virginia have this change of direction from writer to editor was her work on Polly Adler's autobiography, A House Is Not a Home. So, Debbie, how was it that Virginia and Polly Adler came together in the first place?
Well, I'm going to start. Well, first of all, I'm going to start by thanking you for including me, but also thank you for doing this work. Because I am, besides you, I am Virginia Faulkner's biggest fan. I really, everything I have done on Polly has depended tremendously on her, and she's brilliant. She's a beautiful writer, a beautiful editor. I often envied her and took her as my guide, even though I could never know as unfortunately you wrote this book a little late for my purposes, but could have really used this a couple of years ago. um, but I would also start by saying my second starting would be to take issue with that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote, because I think anyone who is a fan of Fitzgerald or American life knows that quote, and I think it was true for him, but it was not.
Yeah.
It is not true in America. I think it's a beautiful line, and it speaks to something real, but it's not true for a lot of people, and that is how Polly and Virginia really come together because Polly is starting her second act. She has, from the age of, she too, like Virginia, was very precocious and very much a wisecracker and not anywhere as educated or erudite, maybe on the other end of the spectrum. She only had left school at the age of 14, and lived on nothing but her wits. And by 19, she was in the sex trades, and by 20, she had opened her first brothel. So while she's about, what is she? She was born in 1900, so she's maybe 10 years older than Virginia is. Um, but by 1945, she was burnt out.
Right.
The world of jazz age, uh, hoopla, the age of, nonsense, wonderful nonsense and delightful criminality, has basically come to an end. And she herself is 45, which is old for an all-night business like being a madam. And so she wants to start a second act, and she begins thinking maybe I should write a memoir, which I guess is how so many people begin their second acts. How she knew Virginia was never totally clear to me. I think she might have met her through Dana. To understand this world, you have to
Yeah,
understand
let me
where.
just jump in on
Go
that
ahead.
point. I don't think I shared this with you because I didn't come across it until much later, but Dana's personal lawyer was Gertrude Gottlieb.
Which is Polly's lawyer in her later
Right.
life.
Yeah. So I
Dana,
think that had something to do with it.
Gertrude Gottlieb was a very famous civil rights lawyer who worked on a lot of important First Amendment cases, and also was known as Dirty Gertie among many of the gay and sex trade community because she would bail people out of jail and get them keep them out of jail. Um, so, but even if it was not, the specifics are not even quite as important as the general world that they lived in, which was the world of Broadway, which of course is a word we associate now almost entirely with the theatrical center of New York City. But in the 20s, teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, it meant this whole culture of gambling, entertainment, midtown, not just midtown, but a whole atmosphere and attitude towards life that was louche and open, let's call broad-minded, I guess might be the way to say it, and that had really flourished and come to the fore during Prohibition. Basically, that world of criminality or loose, maybe it's not exactly criminal, but it's the party world, the underground party world comes to the fore when liquor is banned, and all of a sudden the things that we did perfectly legally now become forbidden. All of a sudden it changed the culture, as anyone who knows about the 1920s would know, right? That was certainly Polly's heyday. Um, Virginia doesn't arrive until what, 1930? Is that her first year? She comes to,
Right.
is that right? Am I correct?
33, well, 33, she went to, late 33, she went to Washington and she arrived in New York, I want to say early September 34.
Oh, okay. So she's coming just as Prohibition has ended.
Right,
The grand glory of the eras but of the 1920s has passed somewhat, but the ethos still remains. Um, so there are, yes, we now have prohibition is over. We don't need to have speakeasies, or as Polly liked to say, she ran a speakeasy with a harem, is really how she thought of her life. She
right,
sold illegal booze and illegal sex. And, but she was larger than that. She was part of this topsy-turvy world where a madam or a gangster or a bootlegger could seem glamorous and could be a respected host. And Polly became famous for her parties. Her parties would have literally Jock Whitney or Averell Harriman, or they might have literally some little scumbag from the gutter who might rob you as you were leaving, although she did try to vet her guests. And she had many, many, many people from showbiz in her orbit, as still probably might be true. And in particular, she had many people from the world of music, because this New York is still the center, Tin Pan Alley, it is still called,
right,
is the center of the musical world. And she entertained all of the big names and many of the small names in that world. And Dana Suisse was part of that. And so that's why I've always given Dana the credit, because she was friends with many of Polly's friends, like Oscar Levant or Irving Berlin, or everybody in that world. She too, like Virginia and like Polly, was one of those precocious young women who was drawn to the bright lights and was able to make her way based on almost nothing but grit and talent.
right.
Um, and charm, and charm. They all had their own kind of charm. The other part of, I think, what got them together was the gay world, which is still, it's not like it is today, where it's, you can be completely out of the closet, but you could be sort of out of the closet in New York, and especially in Broadway, because again, that broad-minded, anything goes atmosphere. And Polly
Right.
was sometimes rumored to be a lesbian. I mostly think at a certain point she just shut down. I don't think she had many intimate relationships, and I think she went off of sex fairly early in her life, as far as that as a motivating drive. Um, but she was a home away from home for a lot of the gay community, both male and straight. And she had many, many friends in the hell-raising lesbian or bisexual community. Many, many, many. So it would have been almost, it almost seems inevitable that Virginia, Ms. Wisecracker, heavy drinker, gay community would have met them. Um, how they knew, I did not realize quite how much Dana also maybe steered the book project. But I thought it was sheer luck that Polly got Virginia to write this book. Maybe we could turn to that if that's what if there, maybe I
Yeah.
don't know, I
Yeah,
don't
I
want to
mean
talk.
that's sort of an interesting thing and that you did tip us off and I guess we do have to dance around this a little bit because there is a surviving notebook that is in the hands of a private collector who wants to stay private. But Debbie, tell us a little bit about coming
That's right.
across that notebook and what it showed you about a house is not a home.
Well, so as you mentioned, there are these rumors that Virginia had written the Polly's. So her second act is to publish a massive best-selling memoir. I mean, not it's a thin book, not a massive book, but it's a massive bestseller. Easily sells 2 million copies. Translated into a dozen languages. It transforms Polly from being a subversive, if infamous figure, to actually being a literary lion, as the New Yorker calls her. She had a lot of friends on the New Yorker staff, so that helped. Um, but that process, I'm working first from her memoir. That's how I discovered Polly. Nobody remembers her anymore. Sure, they remember her friends like Lucky Luciano or Dutch
Right.
Schultz, but nobody remembers her. But I ran across her memoir in a library, just looking through the Yale library, and there it was, and it leapt out at me in a way that almost felt, I am not superstitious, but it felt sort of like it was calling me. There was no reason to take it up, and then I thought, my God, look at this story. She knows everyone. I didn't even know how many people she knew because this book is so whitewashed. It's incredible, even when she's half lying and leaving out all the good stuff. And I thought, okay, so I happened to know the person who had reissued Polly's memoir. She says, well, this is the rumor, Virginia Faulkner, but we don't know. I mean, and she's a historian, doesn't want to speculate too much. So I start diving into Virginia Faulkner and I encounter everything that you just described. I read My Heyday and I read The Barbarians, and these are not helping that much. I can see that she's part of that Broadway wisecracking world. I go look at her stuff in Nebraska. Yes, you can. I mean, I hadn't gone to Nebraska yet, but I had looking around and I'm like, yeah, I mean, I can see it, but how is this helping me? Sorry, that's what every writer wants to know. How is this going to help me move forward? And then this is the early days of the internet, the early days. It's around 2008, 2009. I just start typing in Virginia Faulkner and Polly Adler as search terms. And now it would be a very different world than 2008. But what comes up is literally one thing on an old-fashioned bulletin board saying, I found a suitcase with papers from a woman named Polly Adler
Oh, wow.
and Virginia Faulkner. Does anyone know what these are worth? So my first response is, these are worth nothing to anyone except me. I've got to get it. And again, the superstitious value. I have only been to Nebraska once in my entire life, to Lincoln, loved it, was very impressed by it. I was going to speak at the University of Nebraska, and I met this fellow who is a demolition guy, and he had been tearing down the building that I believe her brother had owned at one point, or his
Right.
insurance company had owned.
Yeah.
And he found this in what was her brother's office, a little suitcase. It even, just to really hit the superstitious quality, little straw suitcase, and it had a little tag on it that said Revelation. What kind of tag is that for a suitcase? Uh, and I was like, wow. And he meets me, and I think he was suspicious, like I was a big city slicker coming in to try to. And he also is a little had a chip on his shoulder because his family apparently makes a lot of fun of him for picking up stuff as he goes along because he's clearly an antique collector. And I was like, well, this was a good one. And it turned out to have her writing. It didn't have everything, but it had her notebooks, the notebooks she thought were most important. It had some correspondence. I don't think it had any photos, but it was enough to be, including a list of everyone who was not allowed to be mentioned in the book. And this was during, you probably are all too young to remember the Kefauver hearings on gangsters and organized crime in the 50s, but it was a big televised scandal. And literally every person Virginia is not allowed to mention in the book is currently being interviewed by the federal government. Uh, and it was enough, it just blew open my world. It led me down a million different paths. And it really cemented my feeling, which is that Virginia is a genius. She took Polly's memories, which were much compromised by her secrecy. As Virginia said, it must be either, if not a constitutional problem, that she doesn't like to name dates and names. At least it's a professional habit that
Right.
she's lived her whole life being secretive. And so it was very hard to get what she needed out of it. But also you can just see the class because every once in a while there are letters from Polly describing a scene that Virginia is asked about, and she's using, she talks like somebody who didn't, have an education, a combination of a Yiddishy, Broadway, Brooklyny kind of accent, and her letter writing is filled that same way with her punctuation and her capitalizations, and you can see Virginia both class it up and give it a little spark that sometimes it didn't have. In fact, I had to be really careful in quoting from the memoir because I didn't want too much of Virginia's voice. I wanted
Yeah.
all her brilliance. I just didn't want it to be too classy. Let's face it, too elegant. And the reviews of the book when it comes out are amazing. They are incredible. And what they say is somehow Polly Adler, this, uneducated madam, has managed to write a book that is incredibly elegant, eloquent, high-toned, and yet filled with the verve and vocabulary and humor of this era. Well, that, to be honest, Polly did the living, but Virginia really did the writing. And I'll stop here by with ending with two different quotes, two because I could talk about this all day long, and it'll only get dirtier as it goes on. So it's just as well that we stop here. There were two different quotes that I loved. That Polly, when Polly's seeing close to the final manuscript, it's not. Virginia has also chosen these beautiful epigrams, or excuse me, epigraphs for every chapter, and some of them are really high toned, like Henry Bergson or Hemingway, and they are really literary and very trenchant, and Polly is thrilled. She actually says, "This is going to be the classiest whorehouse book that ever has been. You really." And she's thrilled, happy to take all credit for it. Then the other quote that I came across, which I cared about even more, was Virginia saying, I tell you what, sometimes I think, why am I being a writer? But it turns out running a brothel is just as hard. And you know what? Oh, and she says, turns out writing a book just as hard as running a brothel. So, maybe I'm going to be in the whorehouse one way or the other. And Polly says, well, listen, if I had known how hard writing a book would be, I would have stuck to running a brothel. So, you take what you can. You take your consolations where you can get them.
Yeah, and
So,
Virginia did write one of her friends, not long after she finally got rid of the Polly Adler project, that she said, it's been nice to go a month without having to type the word whorehouse.
yeah, hey, that's how I felt. And the language I use now, my friends are like, that I just toss off. I shouldn't say this in front of such a respectable audience, but I gave a paper the other day and someone said, well, fellatio is the Latin way to say the word fellatio. And I was like, well, see, I should have classed it up even more. I will say one last thing, because I know we got to move on, but I do think she did get paid a flat fee. I think she was paid like a flat fee of $800. Virginia. I think that
Uh-huh.
she just didn't take any rights. She didn't take, which she could have, that which should have, quite frankly. But she did get paid a little, not much
Okay.
for the amount of work.
I mean, she later said she didn't, but it might have been she received a check but just didn't get
But
it for
yes, and that
it.
was not even
Yeah.
clear. And then what she meant was they had at some point, Polly had offered her like some portion of
Yeah.
future earnings
Right.
or and decided then let it go. That's I
Yeah.
think what
Yeah.
happened.
Well, shifting here now. So this, as I argue, is sort of like Virginia's first exposure to what putting a book together from the editor's side, from not the writer's side. Um, and Virginia first got involved at the University of Nebraska Press, as I mentioned, doing this Nebraska anthology roundup. And one of the essays in Roundup is called Willa Cather of Red Cloud, which was by a woman who would be variously a competitor and a collaborator with Virginia Faulkner in their various and respective Cather projects over the next 25 years. So, Will, tell us a little bit about Mildred Bennett of Red Cloud.
Yeah, Virginia Faulkner and Mildred Bennett were similar in age. Mildred was a few years older. They came to their interest in Willa Cather from very different backgrounds. Virginia grew up as one of two children in a wealthy family in Lincoln, socially privileged. She was not encumbered by heavy-handed religious influences in her upbringing. Mildred grew up as the youngest of five children in a fundamentalist Seventh-day Adventist family. Her father was a self-righteous religionist. He was a part-time school teacher and part-time farmer, and his inability to get along well in any particular locale meant that the family moved frequently from communities starting in South Dakota, where Mildred was born, to Iowa, and then to Kansas through the course of her upbringing. Her childhood and adolescence were really dominated by the puritanical rules of Seventh-day Adventism. And there were many rules about how to live. One thing, reading fiction was prohibited. There were many, works of fiction were seen as a pernicious influence, as were any writings by infidel writers. And however, Mildred's free-thinking nature was not fully suppressed. She did manage to sneak in some fiction reading by finding hiding places in the house. By the time Virginia Faulkner was a student at Lincoln Public High School, she had been introduced to a broad array of literature, including Cather's books. Mildred didn't read anything by Willa Cather until she was in her early 20s, had left the church, and was in her first year as a public school teacher in a small town named Innavale in Nebraska. But it would be another 14 years before Mildred began her immersion in Cather. In 1946, she decided to write a biography of Willa Cather. And within a few years, after that book was published in 1951 as The World of Willa Cather, Mildred was living in Red Cloud, and there were a growing number of Cather pilgrims arriving in Red Cloud, looking to see and learn more about the world of Cather's Nebraska upbringing. And so this led Mildred and her collaborators to found the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial, which is now called the Willa Cather Foundation and the National Willa Cather Center.
Okay. Now, early on in her time at the University of Nebraska Press, Virginia was passionate about, kind of elevating Willa Cather as this great writer, world-class great writer. And she had an idea. She had become obsessed with Cather during the time that she was working on the Polly Adler memoir. And she and Mildred had she'd kind of decided, well, we'll collaborate on putting this Cather book together that they refer to as The Road Is All. And then that project sort of kind of fell apart, and Virginia sort of was casting doubts on Mildred's ability as a writer and as a researcher. What happened with that? Because it led to a point where essentially Virginia sends her a letter saying the University of Nebraska Press doesn't want to work with you on this anymore. What happened from Mildred's perspective?
Well, in 1960, which was around the time that this disintegration happened that you're referring to, Virginia and Mildred had been discussing doing this book. They were calling it The Road Is All, Aspects of the Life and Writing of Willa Cather. Various scholars would contribute chapters to the book. Both Virginia and Mildred had particular interest in seeing chapters that explored various aspects of Cather's personal psychology. The book would also include a bibliography and a list of publications and so on. And so as they were mulling this book idea, Virginia was in the midst of working with Mildred on a paperback edition of The World of Willa Cather. It had been pretty much out of print for a few years, and it was the Bison series of paperbacks. They wanted to make it part of that. The original edition of that book included no source notes. The publisher wanted no notes, no index, none of that apparatus. They just wanted the text and the pictures. And so in doing the paperback, they of course wanted to add these features to the book. And this was really difficult for Mildred to pull off, and she struggled with it. And as Virginia saw Mildred struggling to get the notes together for this paperback edition of The World of Willa Cather, and having had some previous experience of frustration working with Mildred on some editorial work, Mildred, I think, or Virginia, just realized that she just didn't have the time or patience to work as closely as Mildred needed to be worked with on some of these tasks. So Virginia proposed a collaborator, an English professor at the University of Nebraska Lincoln by the name of Robert Huff. He had just recently had a book published by Nebraska on William Dean Howells. And clearly Virginia had a high regard for his ability and thought that he would really help to kind of make things work. But this was absolutely unacceptable to Mildred. She just completely rejected it. Even when Virginia sort of just very point blank said to Mildred, "You don't have the selectivity or the organizational ability or the accuracy to do the book yourself." Mildred just basically said, I'll do the book myself. If you decide you like it and will publish it, fine. If not, I'll go somewhere else. Or, she just wouldn't do that. Working with Huff for Mildred might have been a very fruitful collaboration. But of course, it would have completely impinged on Mildred's sense of autonomy. Mm-hmm. And it's very likely, I think, that she would have been to some degree overshadowed by the professor in the publication of this book. Also, of course, the proposal that Virginia made of this collaboration hit Mildred as a very unflattering assessment of her capabilities. But in fact, Mildred was not strong in organizational ability or accuracy in her research and writing. And it was something that she did acknowledge among friends in the coming years. But anyway, this proposed book project just did not go anywhere.
Right.
I do want to mention that Mildred had, in a sort of more global way, Mildred had many fragmenting realities within herself and externally. She was burdened with what is now known as religious trauma syndrome and her ongoing efforts to recover. She was bipolar or manic depressive, as she knew it. She was prone to migraines that came along with appalling frequency and sometimes wiped her out for several days at a time. She had,
as was the case with Virginia too.
Virginia too.
Both, and one of the sad things is that Virginia was completely was not in any way empathetic with what Mildred was going through, even though she had the same issues she dealt with in her life.
And then Mildred had a demanding home life. She had various community involvements. She was immersed in running the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial, which was growing. It had acquired buildings that needed attention. I mean, there were administrative tasks that were very consuming for her, as well as all this other stuff going on. So it just, for a whole range of reasons, it just never developed.
Right.
Yeah.
And that sort of tension kind of went on throughout the next 2 decades, really, it didn't it? That the various Cather publishing projects, both Virginia and Bernice Sloat, her partner, went on the board as the Cather Center developed and
Mhm.
helped organize various conferences and things like that. As we're
Yeah.
coming toward the hour, I want to open it up. Yeah, thank you for it because the whole I think one of the things that I came to appreciate much more when I laid out this book and did the initial discussions with the University of Nebraska Press. I couldn't see that there would be a lot of material related to Act Two, which is Virginia's life as an editor. And it became clear, particularly in the Cather projects that she took on, sometimes with Mildred, sometimes against Mildred Bennett, that was a much larger part of her overall work. And actually, I think arguably the one that Virginia came to feel take the most pride into versus her time as a writer. Uh, let's open it up
May I ask
for
a question? May I ask
yes.
a question? Um, when I first was encountering Virginia Faulkner, that was really what she was known for helping to resurrect, it sounds ridiculous to put it that way now, Cather's reputation and cement it in American literary history. Um, but it was, and so that was, of course, fascinating. Although again, not related to my damn whorehouse. But the one thing I did also hear at that time was that there was a sense that Bernice Sloat, her partner, and Virginia Faulkner, and some of their compatriots, maybe perhaps Mildred Bennett, wanted to soft pedal the possibility and maybe fact that Cather was a lesbian. Now maybe she
Right.
wasn't entirely, but she
Right.
certainly had a full-time life partner who was a woman. Is that true? Is that a rumor that no longer really applies now that you know more? What do you
Yeah,
think about that?
this is one of the things I sort of struggled and hopefully have, unpeeled in the book. So just as a point of reference, the obsession with Cather that happened with Virginia was as she was finishing up the Polly Adler book, sort of to get away from New York, she goes completely to the other side of the country and she rents a motel room in Pacific Grove, California, in Monterey. And she holds up there for like 3 years. And a lot of what she's doing is she's reading Cather, but she's also reading other books about Cather. And she feels, and there are some surviving notes of this project. She feels that essentially through what we would today call close reading, that you can find that she feels that she finds that Cather is unconsciously lesbian. And in fact, she sort of boasts to several people she knew in the publishing business, including this guy named Bill Koshland, who was worked for Knopf and eventually became CEO of Knopf, a gay man that she knew from her New York days. And Koshland sort of knows where she's going when she refers to it and says, sort of back off. You don't expect that Knopf can do anything with that, nor could Cather's other publishers. And fast forward, she gets back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and one of the things she has great roots in Lincoln. So her English teacher in high school was Elsie Cather, Willa's sister. Her vice principal at Lincoln High was Olivia Pound, who was Louise Pound's sister. And the two Pound sisters lived together and used to have young women in for teas on Sundays. Louise Pound, if you know about Willa Cather, she was the first woman essentially that Willa Cather fell in love with. And one of the things that happens is one of Willa Cather's friends from that time when Willa was a student at the University of Nebraska, Mariel Gear, shares with Virginia some letters that got donated to I think Duke University, but an archive in North Carolina. including some that Cather writes sort of bearing her soul because she has sort of expressed her love to Louise Pound, and Louise Pound has kind of said, "Thank you, but I'm not interested." And it devastates Cather, and she writes very frankly to Mariel Gear and her mother that she's devastated by this. And Willa saw, or Virginia saw those letters before they all went off to North Carolina. And I think at that point she said, "Oh my gosh, it's not my reading it between the lines." She really was. But the problem at that point was she had to work with Edith Lewis, who was the executor of the Cather State at that time, also working with members of the Cather family. Nobody on that side of the house wanted to talk about this at all. And we have to bear in mind, Lincoln, Nebraska in 1960 was not a place that was going to celebrate this information. Yeah, it was so. What I think happened was that I would argue that the message behind how both Virginia and Bernice Sloat approached Cather was really to sort of free her of all the adjectives, and except maybe world great writer, world class. So they didn't. I mean, regionalist was the number one adjective that they were fighting against because a lot of writers got lumped into that. I mean, somebody like Oli Rovag is, still classed as a regionalist writer. So she felt that that was a limiting factor. By the late 70s, when feminist scholarship and queer scholarship becomes much more to the forefront, they go from essentially saying that's not the important factor to being perceived as reactionaries. And I quote a conference that was in Canada about a year or two before Virginia died, where Bernice got up and essentially said, "No, no, no, that's not true." But they knew it was true. They knew it was true. What I would say is they just didn't feel they could do anything with that information at that time. And by the time the atmosphere was more receptive to it, I think they were no longer sort of the right people to put that message forward.
I wanted to add here, Brad, that to illustrate what you're saying about as times changed and the culture changed, Mildred Bennett was very careful to sit on the fence with regard to this issue. And as the 70s wore on and she came out of her period of many years of stagnation, at one point she was doing an interview with a newspaper reporter who came to Lincoln. He also came to Red Cloud. He also went to Lincoln and talked with Bernice Sloat. And the feature article that he wrote for a Minneapolis newspaper, he quoted Mildred as saying to him of Cather, "If you're in the East, they'll tell you she was a lesbian. And maybe she was. I don't know how anybody is ever going to prove it." And this was really quite bold for her to actually speak the word lesbian and to proactively bring it up. He had not asked her about this. Right. And when Charles Cather, the nephew of Willa's, who was at that time in a key role in administering her estate, saw this interview, he was absolutely furious and made a long distance phone call to Mildred and just excoriated her for talking such language and bringing up the topic. And it was such an awful thing to do. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of how all three of these women were very caged in for many years by various factors.
Right, right. Absolutely. Well, let's open, if we've got a few minutes left, let's open up if there are any questions or comments. I see a comment from Samantha Shada who mentions Ron Hall. I dedicate my book to Ron because Ron was really the pioneer in founding educational television, not just in Nebraska, but he went on to be a pivotal figure in the Corporation for Public, the late, belated, and woefully will be resurrected Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Ron was one of the first people that Samantha advised, and he was one of the few people still around at the time who knew Virginia and Bernice personally and intimately. And this book exists first and foremost because of Ron Hull, because he approached the then director of the University of Nebraska Press and said, "Hey, there's this guy working on a thesis about Virginia Faulkner. You guys should absolutely publish the book." And so I was then contacted by the press and asked to submit a book proposal, which I can tell you never happens to a first-time author. So, not without an agent anyway. So, yeah, I mean, Ron, if it hadn't been that overture that Ron made, and what a great guy. I mean, one of the best things about working on this project was the people I got to know, and I'd have to put Ron Hall at the top of the list. What an amazing guy. He, up until the last couple of weeks, in fact, the next to the last time I met him, I went to the Nebraska Educational Television office, which is this impressive multi-story building on the eastern campus of UN Lincoln. And I met him there at 7:30 because that's when Ron would go to work. He was 90, what was he, 91 or something like that, driving a little MG and still going to work every day. Amazing guy. Any questions for before we wrap things up here? Just go off mute or raise a hand. Karen?
It's Karen. I came in late. I got the time wrong. I'm so sorry. Has this been recorded by any
Yes, it
chance?
has.
Oh,
Yes.
perfect.
It will
Oh,
be
wonderful.
available. So on YouTube, if you look for the Neglected Books channel, it will be posted on my channel along with the other
Wonderful.
ones I
Thank
have.
you so much. Okay.
Oh, no, thank you for coming. Anyone else? Well, if not, I will thank again Debbie and Will for joining us today, and for their support throughout this project, which has been absolutely invaluable. I probably would have given up a few times without their advice or support. So thank you so much for joining us today. This will be posted, and I will email the link to everybody who registered for today's session. And I hope you read and enjoy the book. Thank you so much.
It's been great to be with you, Brad. Thanks.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks for doing this, Brad. Thank you.
Yes,
Part.
thanks.
Thank you,
Looking
Debbie.
forward to the book.
Terrific. Thank you.